Ewan McLeod woke to a silence so profound it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, and when he finally worked up the courage to open his cabin door and step outside into gray dawn light, he understood why. 500 Mohican warriors knelt in perfect stillness among the trees surrounding his home, their heads bowed in a gesture of respect so overwhelming that Ewan's first coherent thought was that he must still be dreaming or possibly dying, because nothing in his 19 years of life had prepared him for the sight of an army showing reverence instead of violence, and he had no idea that the elderly man he had pulled from the river yesterday, the stranger whose name he didn't even know, was someone so important that saving his life had just altered the course of Ewan's entire existence in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. If stories about unexpected heroism, the bonds that form across impossible divides, and the moments when simple decency changes everything move you, subscribe now, because this journey will restore your faith in humanity's capacity for gratitude and honor. 24 hours earlier, Ewan had been living the solitary life he had chosen when he fled Scotland 2 years ago after his father's debts had destroyed their family. He was the youngest of 5 sons, which meant he had no inheritance and no prospects in the rigid class system of the Highlands. America had promised opportunity for those willing to work hard and endure loneliness, and Ewan had embraced both with the desperate determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. His cabin was deliberately remote, built in a location that required knowing specific landmarks to find. He trapped beaver and otter along the smaller tributaries of the Hudson, selling pelts to whatever traders asked the fewest questions. He spoke minimal English, almost no Dutch, and had learned perhaps 20 words of Mohican through gestures and repeated interactions with the occasional indigenous hunter who crossed his territory. His life was simple, hard, and blessedly free from the complications of human relationships. That life had ended yesterday afternoon when Ewan was checking his northern trap line and heard the shouts. He had followed the sound to the main river where the spring melt had turned the normally manageable current into a raging torrent. An elderly Mohican man was being swept downstream, clearly exhausted from fighting the water, heading directly toward rapids that would smash him against rocks and drown him within minutes. Ewan didn't think. Thinking would have reminded him that he was a mediocre swimmer, that the water was freezing, that diving into a river to save a stranger was the kind of foolish heroics that got people killed. Instead, he simply acted. He tied a rope around his waist, secured the other end to a sturdy tree, and plunged into the current. The cold was so intense it felt like knives stabbing his entire body. The current was stronger than he had anticipated, immediately pulling him downstream. But Ewan was young and strong from 2 years of hard physical labor, and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He reached the elderly man just before the rapids, grabbed him around the chest, and kicked frantically toward the shore. The rope saved them. It went taut and held, allowing Ewan to pull them both hand over hand back to the riverbank. They collapsed on the muddy shore, both coughing up water and shaking from cold and exhaustion. The elderly man looked at Ewan with eyes that held both gratitude and something else, something that might have been surprise or recognition. The old man spoke in Mohican, words Ewan didn't understand. Then he tried what might have been Dutch or English, equally incomprehensible to Ewan's Scottish ears. Finally, he simply placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly, a gesture that needed no translation. Ewan helped the elderly man back to his cabin, gave him dry clothes and hot broth, and tried to determine where the man had come from so he could be returned to his people. But communication was impossible beyond basic gestures. As evening fell, the old man indicated he needed to leave, to return to his community. Ewan offered to escort him, but the man refused with gentle insistence, pointing to himself and then to the forest as if to say he knew the way. Before leaving, the elderly man had done something strange. He had pulled a small carved stone from a pouch at his belt, held it up to catch the firelight, and then pressed it into Ewan's hand. The stone was smooth and warm, carved with symbols Ewan didn't recognize. The old man spoke one word, slowly and clearly, as if wanting Ewan to remember it. Odina. Ewan had assumed it was the man's name. He had no idea it meant grandfather in Mohican, or that this particular grandfather was the most important spiritual leader in the entire Confederacy. Now, standing on his porch with 500 warriors kneeling before him in the dawnlight, Ewan felt his legs shaking. His hand instinctively moved to the carved stone in his pocket, the one the old man had given him. He had no weapons within reach, no way to defend himself if this massive force decided he was a threat. All he could do was stand there and wait for someone to explain what was happening. A figure emerged from among the kneeling warriors, a man perhaps in his early 40s wearing elaborate regalia that marked him as a leader of significant authority. He walked toward Ewan with measured steps, then stopped perhaps 10 feet away and spoke in careful, accented English. "I am Cho'Gon, war chief of the Bear Clan and guardian of Grandfather Odina," he said. "The man you saved yesterday is the eldest spiritual leader of all Mohican people. He has guided our confederacy for 40 winters, resolved conflicts between clans, maintained our connection to the spirits and the old ways. Without him, our people would fracture and fall to the colonial forces that press against us from all sides." Ewan's mouth was dry. "I did not know," he managed to say. "I only saw a man drowning. I helped because it was right." Shogun's stern expression softened slightly. "That is precisely why these warriors kneel before you," he said. "You risked your life for a stranger without knowing his importance, without expecting reward. You acted from pure spirit, from what our people call renda, the power that flows through all living things when they align with right action." He gestured to the kneeling warriors. "This is how we honor such spirit. This is how we acknowledge a debt that can never be fully repaid." Before Ewan could respond, another figure approached from a forest. It was Grandfather Odina himself, looking far healthier than he had the previous day, though he moved with the careful steps of advanced age. The elderly man's face lit up with recognition when he saw Ewan, and he spoke rapidly in Mohican to Cho'Gon. "Grandfather Odina says you are smaller than he remembered." Cho'Gon translated with the hint of a smile. "He says the river and the fear made you seem like a giant yesterday. But he also says your heart is giant-sized, and that is what matters most." Grandfather Odina approached Ewan and took both his hands in a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so old. He spoke again, and Cho'Gon translated. "He says that yesterday, when he fell into the river, he had been in deep meditation at a sacred site upstream. He received a vision so powerful that he lost awareness of his physical surroundings and slipped on wet rocks. The vision showed him a young man with hair like sunset coming from across the great water to help our people in their time of greatest need. He thought it was a prophecy about the distant future. Then you pulled him from the river, and he understood the spirits work more quickly than we expect." Ewan felt overwhelmed. "I am just a trapper," he said. "I have no special abilities or knowledge. I cannot help your people with their struggles against colonial powers." Grandfather Odina spoke again, his voice firm despite his age, and Cho'Gon translated. "You already have helped us by preserving Grandfather Odina's life, but he believes the spirits brought you here for more than one purpose. He asks if you'll be willing to learn our ways, to serve as a bridge between our people and the Scottish and English traders who respect you." "How would he know traders respect me?" Ewan asked, confused. "We have watched you for 2 years," Cho'Gon said simply. "We know you trap in our territory. We allowed it because you take only what you need. You do not poison the waters or destroy the beaver lodges completely. You trade fairly with the occasional hunter you encounter. These small actions showed character. Yesterday's rescue confirmed it." Ewan looked out at the 500 warriors still kneeling in the forest. "What exactly are you asking of me?" he said carefully. Grandfather Odina spoke at length, and Cho'Gon translated with obvious importance. "Our people face destruction," he said. "The English push from the east, the French from the north, the Dutch from the south. They bring disease, alcohol, weapons, and hunger for land that knows no limit. Our confederacy holds together only because of Grandfather Odina's wisdom and the respect all clans have for him. But he grows old. Soon he will walk the spirit path, and when he does, there will be fighting over who leads next. Some clans will side with French, others with English, others will want to fight all Europeans. This division will destroy us." "What does this have to do with me?" Ewan asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Grandfather Odina believes you can help prevent this destruction," Cho'Gon said. "Not by fighting, not by choosing sides, but by learning our ways deeply enough to teach other Europeans that we are not savages to be destroyed, but people with wisdom worth preserving. He wants to adopt you into the Bear Clan, to teach you our language and customs, to make you a living bridge between worlds. Ewan felt the weight of this request pressing down on him. I came to America to escape obligations and complications. He said quietly, "You are asking me to take on the biggest obligation imaginable." "Yes," Chogon agreed, "but you already took on an obligation yesterday when you dove into that river. You cannot save a man's life and then pretend you have no connection to him. The spirits do not allow such dishonesty." Grandfather Odina spoke again, and this time his words needed no translation. He pointed to Ewan's heart, then to his own, then swept his arm to encompass all the kneeling warriors. The message was clear. You are already one of us, whether you accept it or not. Ewan thought about his lonely cabin, his solitary life, the years stretching ahead with nothing but beaver traps and isolation. He thought about his family in Scotland, destroyed by debt and bad decisions. He thought about the chance to be part of something larger than himself, something meaningful. "I will try," Ewan said finally. "I cannot promise I will succeed at being this bridge you need, but I will learn and I will try." The 500 warriors rose as one, the sound of their movement like wind through a forest. Then they departed as silently as they had arrived, melting back into the trees, until only Chogon and Grandfather Odina remained with Ewan. The war chief explained that Ewan would spend the next months living among the Mohican people, learning their language, customs, and the complex political landscape he would need to understand if he was to serve as an effective bridge between cultures. "Your trapping business will suffer," Chogon said pragmatically, "but we will provide for your needs while you learn. And when you return to trading, you will have knowledge and connections that will make you more valuable than any simple trapper could be." Over the following weeks, Ewan's life transformed completely. He moved to the main Mohican settlement, a collection of longhouses and smaller structures positioned strategically for defense and resource access. He was given a place to sleep in the longhouse of the Bear Clan, surrounded by families who regarded him with a mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and caution. Grandfather Odina took personal responsibility for Ewan's education. Despite his advanced age, the spiritual elder possessed remarkable energy and patience. He taught Ewan the Mohican language through constant immersion, pointing to objects and actions, repeating words until Ewan could pronounce them correctly, gradually building vocabulary and grammar through practice rather than formal instruction. But more than language, Grandfather Odina taught Ewan about the Mohican worldview. He explained how his people saw the natural world not as a collection of resources to be exploited, but as a community of living beings with whom humans had reciprocal relationships. He described the complex clan system that organized Mohican society, the careful balance between men's and women's authority, the spiritual practices that maintained harmony between the physical and spirit worlds. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of instruction, Grandfather Odina spoke about why Ewan's rescue had meant so much. "When I fell into that river," he said through a mixture of Mohican and the English words Ewan was learning, "I felt the spirits calling me to the other side. I was ready to go. I have lived a long life, seen much joy and much sorrow. But then I felt your hands grabbing me, felt your determination to save me even though you did not know who I was. In that moment, I understood I still had work to complete in this world." "What work?" Ewan asked in halting Mohican. Grandfather Odina gazed into the fire. "I must help my people survive what is coming," he said. "The Europeans will not stop expanding. This is their nature now, to always want more land, more resources, more control. We cannot defeat them with weapons. Our numbers are too few. Our diseases have already killed too many. Our confederacy is too fragmented. But perhaps we can survive by adapting, by finding ways to maintain our identity while accommodating the changes that cannot be stopped." "That sounds like surrender," Ewan observed carefully. "No," Grandfather Odina replied firmly. "Surrender is giving up everything, including spirit and identity. Adaptation is changing form while keeping essence alive. A tree that bends in the wind survives. A tree that refuses to bend breaks. I am teaching you so that you can help my people learn to bend without breaking. As spring turned to summer, Ewan's understanding deepened. He participated in ceremonies that honored the planting season, learned traditional methods of agriculture that European farmers dismissed as primitive but which were actually sophisticated and sustainable. He hunted with Mohican men who taught him tracking techniques far superior to anything he had learned in Scotland. He listened to the clan mothers whose authority and decision-making surprised him, having come from a culture where women had little formal political power. He also began to understand internal tensions threatening the Confederacy. Chogon and other warriors wanted to resist European expansion through military alliance with the French, believing that cooperation with one colonial power was the only way to resist others. A faction led by younger sachems wanted to negotiate treaties with the English, trading land and cooperation for guarantees of protection and autonomy. And Grandfather Odina's faction sought a middle path, trying to maintain independence, while selectively adopting useful European technologies and practices. These tensions came to a head during a great council held in midsummer, attended by representatives from all the Mohican clans, as well as delegates from neighboring indigenous nations. Ewan was allowed to observe, sitting quietly in the back of the longhouse while leaders debated the future of their people. The arguments were passionate and sometimes angry. Warriors spoke of honor and resistance, of refusing to surrender ancestral lands without a fight. Elders spoke of pragmatism and survival, of the impossibility of defeating enemies who could replace every soldier killed while indigenous populations continue to shrink from disease. Younger voices spoke of the need to learn European ways, to adopt their technologies and methods, to compete rather than resist. Grandfather Odina spoke last, his voice quiet but carrying authority that silenced all other voices. "My children," he said, "we face a choice between pride and survival. Pride says we should fight to the last warrior, should refuse all compromise, should die free rather than live diminished. Survival says we must adapt, must find ways to preserve our essence even as our form changes. Both paths have honor. Both paths have dignity. The question is which path leads to our grandchildren's grandchildren still knowing they are Mohican." He paused, then continued, "I have lived long enough to see much change. I have seen our people adapt before, have seen us learn new ways while keeping our spirit alive. The young man sitting in the back of this longhouse, he pointed to Ewan, saved my life without knowing who I was or expecting reward. That is the kind of spirit we must cultivate, acting from right intention regardless of personal benefit. If we can maintain that spirit, we can survive any adaptation." After the council, Chogon approached Ewan with a proposition. "Grandfather Odina wants you to travel to the English settlements," he said, "to speak with their leaders about creating formal agreements that recognize our autonomy and protect certain territories from colonial expansion. You would go as our representative, using your European appearance to gain access that we cannot get ourselves." Ewan felt the weight of this responsibility. "I have been here only a few months," he said. "I barely speak your language well enough to follow complex conversations. How can I represent your interests to English authorities?" "You will have guidance," Chogon assured him. "And more importantly, you have something we do not have. You can walk into English settlements without immediately being seen as a threat or a savage to be dismissed. They will listen to you in ways they would never listen to us." The journey to the English colonial settlement of Albany took 3 days, with Ewan accompanied by Chogon and 2 other Mohican representatives who would remain nearby but out of sight during the actual negotiations. As they traveled, Chogon briefed Ewan extensively on what needed to be accomplished. The Mohican people wanted formal recognition of their sovereignty over certain territories, guarantees that these lands would not be seized for colonial expansion, and protection from unscrupulous traders who used alcohol and debt to exploit indigenous communities. "We do not expect miracles," Chogon said as they camped on the second night. "We know the English will not agree to everything we ask. But if we can establish precedent for negotiation rather than simply taking what they want, that is progress. If we can get them to see us as partners rather than obstacles, that improves our chances of survival." When they reached Albany, Ewan was struck by how much the settlement had grown since he had last passed through 2 years earlier. New buildings crowded against old ones, streets bustled with traders and merchants, and the air smelled of commerce and ambition. He cleaned himself as best he could, put on the most respectable clothes he owned, and approached the governor's office with a mixture of confidence and terror. The governor, a man named Robert Hunter, was surprisingly willing to meet with a young Scottish trapper claiming to represent Mohican interests. Ewan suspected this willingness came less from genuine interest in indigenous concerns and more from curiosity about why a European would advocate for native people. Governor Hunter was in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and the careful bearing of a career politician. "So you speak for the savages now," Governor Hunter said without preamble after Ewan was shown into his office. "That is an unusual position for a Scottish subject of the crown." "I speak for people who saved my life and taught me that they are not savages but human beings with wisdom and dignity," Ewan replied, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "They ask only for what any people would ask: recognition of their right to exist, protection of land that sustain them, and fair treatment in commerce and law." Noble sentiments, the governor said dryly, but impractical. The Mohican occupy lands that are needed for colonial expansion. His Majesty's government has invested considerable resources in establishing settlements here. We cannot simply abandon those investments because the previous occupants object. They do not ask you to abandon anything, Ewan said. They ask only that certain territories, particularly those with spiritual significance or critical resources for their survival, be formally protected. In exchange, they offer cooperation, peaceful trade relationships, and assistance in managing conflicts with other indigenous nations who might be less accommodating to English interests. Governor Hunter leaned back in his chair, studying Ewan carefully. "Why should I believe the Mohican can deliver on such promises?" he asked. "They are a fractured people, divided among themselves, weakened by disease and displacement. What guarantees can they offer?" Ewan pulled out the carved stone that Grandfather O'Dina had given him, placing it on the governor's desk. "This stone bears a mark of Grandfather O'Dina, the most respected spiritual leader among all Mohican clans," he said. "He has the authority to speak for the Confederacy, and he has authorized me to negotiate on his behalf. Any agreement reached here will be honored by all clans that follow his guidance, which is most of them." The negotiations that followed were complex and frustrating, lasting over a week. Governor Hunter was a skilled negotiator who understood that appearing to give concessions while actually giving as little as possible was the art of successful diplomacy. But Ewan had learned patience from Grandfather O'Dina and stubbornness from his Scottish upbringing. He pushed back on every unreasonable demand, insisted on specific language that would protect Mohican interests, and refused to accept vague promises that could be reinterpreted later. The final agreement was far from perfect, but it was something. The English government agreed to formally recognize Mohican sovereignty over 3 specific territories, totaling perhaps 15% of their traditional lands. They agreed to establish regulations on the alcohol trade with indigenous peoples and to create a formal process for resolving disputes between colonists and Mohican individuals. In exchange, the Mohican Confederacy agreed to peaceful coexistence, preferential trading relationships with English merchants, and assistance in mediating with other indigenous nations. When Ewan returned to the Mohican settlement with the signed agreement, he was greeted with mixed reactions. Some celebrated the recognition as a significant victory, proof that negotiation could achieve what violence could not. Others saw it as a betrayal, a surrender of the majority of their lands in exchange for empty promises that the English would inevitably break. The debates in the council longhouse were heated and sometimes bitter. Grandfather O'Dina listened to all perspectives before speaking. "This agreement is not a solution," he said. "It is a delay, a breathing space. The English will eventually want more land, will find reasons to violate these promises, will push us further and further until we have nothing left. But this delay gives us time. Time to prepare our people. Time to build alliances. Time to adapt to a world that is changing faster than any of us wished." He turned to Ewan. "You have done well, young bridge builder. You have shown our people that Europeans can be negotiated with, that not all of them see us as obstacles to be removed. You have also shown the English that we are not simple savages, but people capable of sophisticated negotiation and compromise. These perceptions matter. They create space for continued existence." But Grandfather O'Dina's face grew somber. "I must also tell you a truth that weighs on my heart. I am dying. The river rescue gave me extra time, but that time is ending. Within a few moons, I will walk the spirit path. When I am gone, the unity I have maintained will fracture. Some clans will follow the path of negotiation that you have helped establish. Others will choose violence. Still others will simply surrender and accept whatever fate the Europeans impose. This fracturing is inevitable, and you cannot prevent it. Ewan felt grief wash over him. The months he had spent with grandfather Odina had created a bond deeper than he had realized. "What should I do?" he asked quietly. "Continue being a bridge," grandfather Odina replied. "When I am gone, there will be even greater need for people who can speak both languages, understand both cultures, advocate for fairness when profit and power push toward exploitation. You cannot save my people, Ewan. No one can do that. The forces arrayed against us are too powerful, too numerous, too relentless. But you can help individuals survive, can preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost, can be a voice of conscience when conscience is in short supply." Grandfather Odina died 6 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family and clan members. The funeral ceremonies lasted 3 days, with representatives from all Mohican clans and several neighboring indigenous nations attending to pay respects. Ewan participated in the rituals, honoring the man who had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be human, to be connected to others, to have purpose beyond simple survival. In the months and years that followed, Ewan watched grandfather Odina's prophecy come true. The Mohican Confederacy did fracture, with different clans choosing different strategies for dealing with colonial expansion. Some fought and were destroyed. Others negotiated and were gradually pushed onto smaller and smaller territories. Still others simply dissolved, with individuals integrating into colonial society or joining other indigenous nations. But Ewan continued his work as a bridge. He advocated tirelessly for fair treatment of indigenous peoples in his dealings with colonial authorities. He used his trading business to provide fair prices and honest dealing to Mohican trappers and hunters when other traders exploited them. He documented Mohican customs, language, and history, creating records that would survive long after culture itself had been overwhelmed by colonial expansion. He also married a Mohican woman named Ayana from the Bear Clan, and they raised children who moved fluidly between both worlds, speaking both languages, understanding both cultures. These children and their descendants would carry forward the bridge-building work that Ewan had begun, serving as mediators, translators, advocates, and living proof that the boundaries between cultures were not as absolute as either side often insisted. 20 years after pulling grandfather Odina from the river, Ewan stood at that same spot with his eldest son, a boy of 15 named Malcolm. He told the story of the rescue, of the 500 warriors kneeling in the forest, of everything that had followed from one moment of spontaneous courage. "Did you know," Malcolm asked, "when you jumped into that river, that it would change your entire life?" "No," Ewan replied. "I only knew that a man was drowning, and I could help. Everything else followed from that simple choice." "Was it worth it?" Malcolm pressed. "Giving up your quiet trapper's life, taking on all these responsibilities, fighting battles that could never truly be won." Ewan thought about grandfather Odina's wisdom, about the families he had helped, about the small victories and large defeats, about the life he had built with Ayana, and the children who represented hope, that bridges could be built even when walls seemed inevitable. He thought about the alternative, the lonely, isolated existence he had been living before diving into that river. "Yes," he said finally, "it was worth it. Not because I succeeded at saving the Mohican people. I did not succeed at that. The forces against them were too powerful. But because I became part of something larger than myself. Because I learned that we are all connected, that helping others enriches us even when it costs us comfort or safety. Because grandfather Odina taught me that the measure of a life is not in wealth or security, but in how much we give of ourselves to make the world slightly less cruel, slightly more capable of recognizing the humanity in everyone." Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. "I understand," he said, "and I will continue your work. Father, my children will continue it. We will keep building bridges even when others burn them, because that is what grandfather Odina taught you and what you have taught us." Ewan pulled his son close, looking out at the river where it had all begun. The current was calm today. The spring floods long past, the water flowing peacefully between its banks. But he knew that beneath that peaceful surface were currents still powerful enough to sweep a person away, rocks still sharp enough to destroy anyone who underestimated their danger. The river, like the relationship between cultures, required constant respect, constant vigilance, constant willingness to adapt and learn. If this story moved your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that our small acts of courage can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate, that bridges between cultures are built one person at a time through choices to see shared humanity rather than unbridgeable difference, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is not wealth or status, but the example of choosing compassion over convenience, even when that choice costs us everything we thought we wanted. Leave a comment about which moment resonated most deeply with you. Your support helps me continue creating these stories about honor, sacrifice, and the truth that we are all connected by invisible threads of common humanity. Thank you for being here. And remember that somewhere today, someone is drowning, and you have the strength to pull them to safety. May we all have the courage to dive into those dangerous waters, to risk ourselves for strangers, to build the bridges that our divided world so desperately needs. Until next time, stay brave, stay compassionate, and never underestimate the power of one spontaneous act of decency to change not just one life, but the trajectory of entire communities across generations.